definitely some issues that we wanted to try to fix. So what were the goals that we started with? And one is we wanted to make it broader and to cover content because the original license said just code and documentation. So even like, so for example, you know, if I had a PowerPoint presentation and I put it under the EPL 1.0, was that legitimate or not? It was kind of one of those weird questions. Module was the word that was used as the unit of the thing that you licensed in EPL, and file is a lot clearer. People really understand what a file is. A module is a fairly ambiguous term, so that was another one. Choice of law was actually a really big one, particularly you know, here in Europe. So we do a lot of work with the European Union on research projects, for example, and it was always a little bit of an impediment to use a license that specifically mentioned New York law. We wanted to use scripting languages, source code availability, and we'll go through all of these in more detail, including the GPL compatibility that we added. But one of the most important things to understand is the things that that lawyers really care about, like the copyright license, the patent license, the patent termination, those things did not change. So they are identical between the EPL1 and the EPL2. Now there's a lot of changes around the periphery, but those sort of fundamental building blocks of the license did not change. In terms of who worked on this, so we're blessed at the Eclipse Foundation to have an IP advisory committee that has representation on it from some very smart lawyers in the open source world. So we had a lot of help. Like in particular, want to recognize, well, Jeff Newberger, our own lawyer, Terry Carroll from IBM, Richard Fontana from Red Hat, and Jim Wright from Oracle. Did a lot of work on this, and they were extremely helpful. Then there was also a bunch of other lawyers. We had a bunch of public phone calls. We had a public mailing list, and then in particular, the other names there. I should probably have also added Louis Villa to that list, but definitely we had a very active and very helpful set of conversations with lawyers around the world. So, start to go through some of these changes in detail. One was, you know, what is actually contributed. So the original licenses I mentioned earlier said code and documentation. EPL version 2, we widened that to use the word content. So basically anything which is copyrightable can be clearly covered under the EPL version 2, which I think is really important, especially since, as we know, there's lots of artifacts that go into a software project that may or may not fit under the definition of code and documentation. As I mentioned earlier, file versus module. So file is clearly one as a term of art. The EPL is basically the only license on the planet, like only open source license that used the word module. And you know, that was one way of being unique that just really wasn't all that helpful. The other thing is that a couple of years ago, we started using the DCO, the Developer Certificate of Origin from the Linux Foundation, as the basis for accepting inbound contributions. So we have this thing called the Eclipse Contributor Agreement. It's basically some words around the DCO that says that you know that you're contributing your software under the license of the project, and it specifically references file in the DCO. So you're using the same term of art in both our contributor agreement and the license is helpful. And this is like, you know, a one-word change. We literally stroked out module and replaced it with file. So getting rid of the reference to New York state law is actually, it's something that actually required probably the most amount of work of anything that we did, because we really, once you remove a particular legal structure as the context for the license, then you have to try to make it worded so clearly that it will be interpreted in any court in the world using their law, with clarity. And so the kinds of things that we had to do is include a definition for modified works, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, and we also included a definition for derivative works. And so the definition for derivative work is literally a cut and paste out of the US Copyright Act. So the definition of derivative works is exactly the same as what you get in US law. And this is an approach that's been used by the Apache license for many years. The modified works definition has the advantage of now we are very, very clear and explicit about what is the scope of the copyleft. And why that's important is, for example, under EPL 1.0, we just use the term derivative works. There are some lawyers who will argue that subclassing is a derivative work. And if you can think of the amount of code and the amount of frameworks that we've built under the Eclipse license, where you're expected to subclass the code when you write your own application, and if we went back and said, oh yeah, all that stuff is derivative work and you need to make it available under the Eclipse public license, that would, that would be a really awkward conversation to have within the Eclipse community. So this is a much better, much clearer definition for what the copyleft is. We wanted to make sure that the scripting languages like JavaScript could be properly done under the EPL version 2. And this actually required a lot of conversation. In most open source licenses, you will see definitions of this is what we mean by the phrase source code, and this is what we mean by the by binary or executable code. So there's this, almost all licenses have this construct of this is what you do, this is what you can do with the source, and this is what you can do with the binaries. In the end, after trying to use that construct, which is very common, we actually ended up basically just defining what source code is and making it clear that if you get EPL licensed source code, you always have to make that EPL licensed source code available. And that actually simplified the license quite a bit. There was a requirement in EPL1 that the source code had to be made available by the distributor. So strictly speaking, if, say, IBM distributes a product which is based on the Eclipse IDE, they're supposed to have a copy of all of the source code on an IBM server and tell their customers to go get the source code from the IBM server. And I'm not really sure why they put that into EPL 1.0. I guess they didn't, it's probably early days of the internet, et cetera, and they thought that storage was really expensive. But we actually want people to come and get the canonical source code from the Eclipse Foundation or the original place for the code. So that was a simple change to make. I'm not going to go through this one. If these slides, of course, will be available, but basically there's a couple of sort of cleanup sorts of things that we did to make sure that the notice, how you put notices files with code under the EPL is much clearer. And then one thing that we did that I thought, actually, when we first started the process, I thought this was going to be a controversial topic, but it turned out to be pretty straightforward, is that we added GPL compatibility as an option for projects under the EPL 2.0. And the motivation for doing this was extremely pragmatic. We now have a bunch of projects at the Eclipse Foundation that are dual licensed EPL and BSD, and the reason why they're dual licensed is because the project had a good reason to need to be GPL compatible. There needed to be a path that a GPL licensed project could grab that code and use it. Particularly in areas like IoT, for example, where you're working very much in this, with the Linux ecosystem, that had to be an available option. But what that did was that basically you lost the copyleft aspect of the EPL, which is something that we actually think is important. So the idea was, if a new project starts, the initial contributor can say, we want this project to be GPL compatible. So they do this by identifying what's called a secondary license. And we basically lifted this entire construct from the Mozilla version 2 license. So the only difference being the Mozilla license is GPL compatible by default, and we're the opposite. We are not GPL compatible by default. You have to make that point as an option when you first start the project. Yeah, so exactly what I just said. But it is important to understand you have to do this at the outset. So if you have a project which is licensed under EPL1 right now and you want to relicense it under EPL2 and add in a secondary license, you actually need to get the permission of the contributors. In addition to getting rid of the New York law, there was a few things in the EPL 1.0 that were things that I guess IBM wrote the license many years ago, so there's a few things in there that IBM lawyers liked, but didn't necessarily, is not necessarily the kinds of things you see in most open source licenses. In particular, every IBM contract you will ever sign has a clause in it that says you will waive jury trial. Apparently IBM had a really bad experience with juries back in the 60s, and they have very long institutional memory. And one thing, particularly for our German friends, we added, and to the extent permitted by applicable law in the liability and warranty sections, because under German law, you cannot disclaim all warranties. So basically what this is, and what would happen is if you tried to disclaim all warranties, your entire warranty section was null and void. So basically adding this simple sentence to our warranty and liability sections made the EPL 2.0 actually more enforceable in Germany than the EPL 1.0. And I'm saying Germany because we happen to be there, but at the moment, but this applies to a few other countries as well. So actually once we had the license drafted, getting it approved was a bit of a chore, and it was sort of a two-phase commit kind of problem, because I had to simultaneously get the OSI board to approve it and get the Eclipse Foundation board to approve it. So it was like this, the Eclipse board said, yeah, we approve it, you can take it to the OSI said, yeah, we approve it, and then go back to the Eclipse board saying, now that the OSI board has approved it, we can done. And then there was this really weird thing with the Free Software Foundation where we sent them the license, and then 3 months later, they just added it to their list. Like no conversation, the most black box, opaque process I've ever been involved in my life. I think getting licenses approved by the Free Software Foundation involves somebody carving it onto a stone tablet, bringing it to Richard Stallman to read, and then he says, yay, verily, and we all get to move along. And the weirdest thing of all of these, getting it actually included on the GitHub list of licenses has been the hardest thing so far. I mean, I don't get it, but those guys think that there's even more special than the OSI and Richard Stallman. Good for them. So of course, now that we have this new license, if you have a project under the EPL 1.0, why should you be motivated to switch? And one answer is it's definitely a better license for venues outside of the USA. Definitely a better definition of copyleft, much clearer and much more defensible. So generally a better international license. And then finally, if you are an Eclipse Foundation project, the reason you want to change is because we told you so. So when the board approved this license, they also passed a resolution that says all the Eclipse projects have to move, and starting at some point in 2018, when you do a release review for an Eclipse project, we're gonna go, have you changed the license yet? And we'll hassle you if you haven't done it. Sorry, but you know. So actually, what does it mean switching to the EPL 2.0? So the first thing to understand is that the EPL 1.0 and 2.0 has this clause in it that says if the agreement steward, that's the Eclipse Foundation board, says that there is a new version of the license, you can switch without getting the permission of the contributors. So to switch from 1 to 2 it's like you don't have to ask anybody's permission, you just have to update the file headers and notices, that's it. Now we're telling all of our projects that you should socialize this change with your community, like say on the dev list that this release is the one that we're going to be switching on, and just make sure that everybody is actually informed if they care. If you want to switch it to the and add the GPL compatibility, which you may or may not want to do, you do need the permission of the contributors. So the Eclipse OMR project was the first one to do this, and they did it a very, very simple way. They basically, they're on GitHub, so they open up a GitHub issue saying we want to add the secondary license, and on the GitHub issue, they copied the GitHub IDs of all of the people that had contributed code and said, can you please +1 that you agree to this change? And literally in 6 hours later, they were done. Everybody just +1 on the issue, and everybody moved along. Now, of course, if you have like 50 contributors or 100 contributors, that's going to be a lot more difficult. Now, when I say contributors, that does not say if you have 20 committers from IBM and 20 committers from Red Hat on a project, if IBM and Red Hat can make a statement that all of their contributions from all of their people can be relicensed. We're mostly focused here on the sort of drive-by contributors that are not working for any member companies or probably are not a committer on the project. And one thing to keep in mind is that we're asking people to +1 this on an issue, but the author is not necessarily the copyright holder. So if you have GitHub ID Joe Blow, Joe Blow might work for let's say a really nice company like Qualcomm. Joe Blow might have to ask permission from Qualcomm to say that they can make that contribution. And where we can, we try to make sure that they understand that distinction. And then finally, while we're asking the projects to update their file headers to use EPL 2.0, we're also changing the basic structure of the Eclipse Foundation legal documentation. So one of the big things about this is we've simplified the file header. So anybody here who's worked on an Eclipse project, will recognize sort of the default file header that we tell people to use, and this is basically the major differences. So we had a lot of grief over the years for including the words "all rights reserved," which is kind of a strange thing to see on a piece of open source code. Legally, it's correct. It just means all rights other than the ones granted to you in the open source license, but it's just kind of annoying, and so we took that one out. We made, instead of accompanies the distribution, there's a URL that points to the license, and we no longer require projects to list all of their contributors in the file header. We're moving that to the notice file. And thank you, Kai, it was your idea all along. We finally did what you told us to. What's that? Yeah, we just made you do all that work for nothing. So here's what the basic EPL2 file header looks like. Yes? Well, we're going to get there. The answer is no. You still have to have a copy of the license, but it goes into the notice file. Used to be, if you are shipping an Eclipse plugin style project, you can pretty much keep doing exactly what you're doing now. But if, let's say, for example, you're shipping in IoT or Eclipse Jetty, like things that are sort of runtime-ish, the previous structure that we had for where the license file went and the software user agreements and all that kind of stuff is sort of weird. It doesn't actually fit very well with those kinds of projects. So this is mostly addressing those kinds of projects. But it is actually, by the way, it is generally considered good open source hygiene to have a physical copy of the license with your distribution. Apache does it, Debian does it. This is not unique to Eclipse. But we'll see that in a second. So one aside is that we've started using SPDX identifiers. So the SPDX identifier for the EPL 2.0 is EPL-2.0. And SPDX gives us a way to have basically a grammar to describe what the licensing is for the projects. And so if you did an example, this is an example where you have a project that's licensed under EPL 2.0, dual license under EPL and Apache. The SPDX expression for that would be EPL 2.0 or Apache 2.0. And the or there is to say that you as the consumer can pick which license you want. One thing that we're still working with the SPDX on a little bit. I think we're done, but we're not. We don't have complete and final agreement. Is when you use a secondary license, how is that? What's the right SPDX expression for that? We're pretty sure this is right, but we're still having a few more conversations. So it's basically an OR. So basically, this is more like a coffee conversation, but effectively adding a GPL secondary license to the EPL 2.0 is very, very, very close to dual licensing. So that's why there's an OR there. And then sort of answering your question, so under the generalized legal documentation requirements, don't panic if you're shipping an Eclipse plugin, you don't have to change anything. But if you want to change to this new structure because you're doing a runtime project, basically you've got your license file and a notice file. So what's in the license file? So a header that says this program and accompanying terms, sort of like the same thing that you see in the file header, and then a text of the EPL and a text of any other licenses that might apply here. So that anybody who gets your distribution can read the license file and have a copy of the licenses that are applying to the source code to that project. And there's a difference between the license of the project and licenses that are third-party content. So this is where we have about.html files historically at Eclipse, and that's going to start moving into the notices file. So this is where you start seeing, this is a secondary license example. So if you have a secondary license, then you're going to end up including the copies of the license as well. And some of them can get really complicated because the secondary license is GPL 2.0 or higher, with also including any exceptions. So if you want to link your code, for example, with OpenJDK, you have to reference both the class path exception and the assembly exception. And so this is an example of how you would go about doing that. Then there's also a notices file, and the notices file is going to document, and this is an example that we lifted off of J9. Notice that we actually include trademark notices now, which we've never historically done. And we've started to include a list of declared project licenses. So basically the idea is the notice is going to give you basic project metadata, including the SPDX identifier, the declared project licenses, list of the copyright holders, third-party content licenses, and any cryptography notices if that is applicable to your project. And the good news is Wayne Beaton, who unfortunately couldn't be here this week, has a prototype legal documentation generator. So the URL is there, but now this is experimental and it's a first start. But he is building a tool that will basically generate all of your notice files for you based on the metadata for your project that's in the PMI, the project management infrastructure. So hopefully this will end up being perfect and no manual labor will be required. But amongst the things that it's going to do is it's actually going to go and look through the Git blame records for all the contributors in your project and use that to list the contributors in your notices file. So if you want to read more, these are the links for the EPL2. We just last week published an FAQ. And so if you have questions about the EPL 2.0, I strongly suggest that you read that FAQ. It's a lot of work went into it. And if you have suggestions for more questions to add to the FAQ, you can do that on EPL-discuss. That's the mailing list where we can add new stuff. And that's it. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Yep. Any questions? Yep. Yes. So the EPL, both version 1 and version 2, are a weak copyleft license. So no, you do not have to contribute you would not have to open source your entire product. But basically think of like a line between the EPL code that you're building on top of and your product. All the stuff that you build on top of the EPL code, you can use your own proprietary license for. If you start making changes to the EPL code itself, those changes have to be made available under the EPL. That's the first point. The second point is, if you have proprietary code and EPL code, you can ship that combination under your own proprietary license. So section 4 of the EPL, which we did not change at all, except clarifying the defined terms, specifically allows you to ship EPL binaries derived from EPL source code under a proprietary license. So you can deliver a full product to your customers under under commercial terms. Yep. No. No. So if just because it's secondary license, you can use it under the EPL just as I described before. The addition of the secondary license says that if you so actually, I should have repeated the question. So the question is, if I use EPL 2.0 and the secondary license GPL is turned on, does that mean that I have to comply with the GPL with my product and make all of the source code for my product available? And the answer is no. In the commercial context, you're just using EPL 2.0 exactly as I described before. There's no change. What does change is if you take the EPL 2.0 code and combine it with something else that's GPL 2.0, you can choose to distribute that combination under GPL 2.0. But in the commercial case, in the commercial case, nothing changes. But as soon as you combine it with GPL, and it's the other GPL that's going to bring the requirements to conform to the GPL along, it's not the EPL code that's bringing that along. So you would have this, if you would have that requirement because you've already included other GPL code. Make sense? Okay. Any other questions? Yes? Okay, so I'll repeat the question. So why did we make this the secondary license an opt-in as opposed to the default, the way Mozilla did? And the answer is because we didn't want to. And the reason why we didn't want to is because we've got 15 years or more of history of people shipping code under the Eclipse public license. And they've always done it under those terms. If we made it the default that all of a sudden it's GPL compliant, that is a really big change to the legal dynamics of the ecosystem. So if you can imagine, if you are, like IBM is probably the biggest copyright holder under the EPL 1.0, right? If you add the GPLs as a secondary option, that's a very large change to the agreement that they made when they made that code under the EPL the first time. And that's, by the way, exactly the same reason why we say that if you want to add the secondary license to an existing project, you have to go back and ask the permission of all of the contributors. So let me put it this way. When you contribute code under the EPL 1.0, you're contributing the code under, you're giving certain rights to that code. And those rights are word for word what's in the EPL 1.0. You did not provide that code under the GPL, right? So we can't just like willy-nilly say, yeah, poof. Well, actually, strictly speaking, legally we could have, but it's really not fair to the contributors to do that kind of massive relicensing without their explicit permission. And as a practical matter, there's not a chance in hell the board would have voted for it. So, but I think even without that, I think just morally and ethically, it would be a bad choice. You would be putting added permissions on code that was not the expectation of the people that contributed it. You're obviously a big fan of the GPL. Sure, but the... Yeah. Right, but that's your personal value judgment. There are I know for a fact that there are people, individuals, who have contributed code under the EPL 1.0 specifically because it is incompatible with the GPL. Right, I've met these people. They do exist. So, next question? Yes, Kai? Yep. So to repeat the question, the change from file to module, doesn't that actually change the semantics? Because in the OSGI context, if you change something in the module, you would have to open source the entire module. And yes, you're right. However, as a matter of practicality, if you change a file, in the end, you get the same result. But the more important thing is that we are getting a lot of projects at the Eclipse Foundation and under the EPL elsewhere that are not OSGI. So I don't think it makes any sense for the Eclipse Foundation to tie its license to any particular technology, especially when we have a solution that's more general purpose and gets you to maybe not exactly the same result, but effectively the same result. Oh yeah, but look, the only thing about, so Kai, let me give you a concrete example. You know, Genoa Tech has never given a line of code to the Eclipse Foundation. They have their darkest dark theme that is breaking Eclipse IDE installations because they use code weaving so they can avoid the copyleft. If somebody really doesn't want to contribute code back to the upstream project, they will always figure out a way to not do it. So I think I am convinced that the benefits far outweigh the costs of not tying our license to any particular technology. Yeah. Elwad, did you have a question? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's clear to me that the word file is a much more understood term of art than the word module. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.